Teal dear, let's talk about the so-called manosphere.
Not what you expected, right? And yes, let's do that.
And specifically on the topic of intellectual rigour versus straight-up slam-dunk mic-dropping ponage. This topic today was certainly inspired by a couple of videos I've seen recently that I thoroughly recommend you check out first, so that you hopefully can see why I'm taking the tack on this topic that I am. First is The Red Pill Then and Now by Stardust, and the second, The Manosphere by Coltane.
We'll get onto those videos later.
In these videos, both address the current state of the loosely connected groups that are often called the manosphere of the internet, the loose alliance of MGTOW, the men's rights movement, pickup artists, and the general anti-feminist crowd.
Yes, it was discussing, but this discussion was neither charitable, unbiased, nor was it in any way indicative of reality.
MGTOW shows them things about themselves that they really don't want to see.
Yes, we've gone to conspiracy theorist you can't handle the truth territory.
MGTOW is a mirror. The PUAs hate what MGTOW shows them about the value they place on pussy, as well as the lengths those poor saps will go to, debasing themselves trying to get it.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to assume PUAs are that self-aware, because I don't think they are. Otherwise, their arguments against MGTOW would not consist of 99+% sex shaming.
The MRAs hate what MGTOW shows them about the long-term ineffectiveness of their political activism.
You know in your heart that God is real. You're just denying it because you hate God. Are we really going with the MGTOW equivalent of presuppositional apologetics? Sane Coltane.
And finally, the anti-feminists, whether white nationalists or self-proclaimed skeptics, hate what MGTOW shows them about their own self-constructed social narrative. Women are sugar and spice and everything nice. It's not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. It's all feminism. It's all Marxism. It's the welfare state. It's the fucking Jews. But it's never women.
Anti-feminists, you've got the wrong scapegoat.
As Stardust has pointed out, anti-feminism has become a genre in and of itself on YouTube. To be clear here, I don't see this as inherently bad. Anything that helps to clear the air of their intentional misinformation on whatever topic feminism has deemed is problematic today is ultimately a good thing, as long as they are addressing the objective empirical data on the issue and demonstrating the flaws in the supposed science of the issue or the logical and philosophical inconsistencies of their rhetoric.
So, if someone were to upload a video of Trigglypuff with some music behind it mocking her, then that's bad, because it's not arguing against the specific points of feminism. Well, no. Because mockery isn't necessarily for them. It's not arguing against other people. It is preaching to the choir, effectively. But it's just to help people stay sane. If I'm tired and I just don't want to think, or I'm not actually at my computer, then a long sort of 40-minute Tilde video might not be the sort of thing I want to watch at that point. Maybe I just want to hear Bearing mock someone.
In reality, what I've been seeing is a rise of the Poner.
Now, I wouldn't have a problem if Tilde were just going to criticize this behavior in abstract. Which, okay, is fair enough. I don't mind you using certain examples and explaining why you don't necessarily think this is the most productive way to go about it. However, what you're going to do is you're going to say that these behaviors are common and indicative of the anti-feminist community. However, you're not going to provide any examples of it. You're not going to show what this behavior looks like in context. Which also makes your claims unassailable, and I will get onto that.
The so-called debunker, the so-called skeptic. People who don't actually address the core premise of either the ideas nor the reasoning behind the motivation, but instead will simply offer what is often termed a rebuttal but in reality is little more than calling the feminist in question a fucking moron and saying you're wrong because you're stupid, with very little substance behind the argument.
Now, before we get into whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, my question would be, do you have examples of these? Or in other words...
Citation needed.
And honestly, I fear that this rise in flimsy debunking content creators...
Who do you mean? Who is guilty of this? At the moment, this whole "I'm not aiming this at anyone" is you pointing a submachine gun at the whole anti-feminist community on YouTube and just spraying. I'm not shooting anyone!
While useful in swelling the ranks of visible opposition to modern feminism and social justice, actually does nothing to help in either its downfall or in helping people to understand the reason why things have become the way they currently are.
Yeah, not every single piece of content has to do that. Not every single content creator has to do that. Sometimes it's a better idea just to, well, mock the shit out of a crazy person, because that gets you through the hard bits. Remember, content creators are just people too. Sometimes you do need a break from the serious shit.
And if anything, actually end up working counter to their own good intentions. In doing a call-out video or a takedown video or a debunking video, phrases I hear from people on a daily basis as requests, when that video takes the form of nothing more than a string of witty insults and put-downs, this only serves to solidify the feminist or social justice advocates' views that the world is a terrible place full of misogynists or bigots or racists or whatever ist or ism they'd care to label you, and then be thrown back into the social justice cauldron of evidence that perpetuates its own existence.
Yeah, but these are the kinds of people who say denial of rape culture is proof of rape culture. These people will see anything that exists as proof. That high rape reports are proof of rape culture, and low rape reports are proof that people aren't reporting and therefore rape culture.
For every video that looks at the data behind a study or a piece of supposed evidence that social justice feminist will use and demonstrates the flaws in methodology, sample size, etc., there are 10 that basically just say, you're wrong because you're dumb. Also, you're ugly.
Oh, then they must be not hard to find. Do you have an example? Or in other words...
Citation needed.
It is important to note here that even videos that do cover the data and address the core of the arguments will also still be dismissed as proof of misogyny or simply hand-waved away as harassment. But to the outside viewer, to see one person spouting rhetoric and the other countering with hard data provides a clear winner. To look in and see two people swapping rhetoric and insults demonstrates neither side to be the victor, and leaves the viewer to decide on their own on which side they favour best.
Well, true, because videos with nothing but mockery in them aren't designed to convince people. And it's actually videos with a balance of mockery and hard data that do the best anyway.
And we'll see why that is a problem later, especially when one of those parties is female or is claiming to act in the interests of women.
By later, do you mean in another video? Because you don't actually go into that.
This is something that I think needs to be addressed, and is something I do not exclude myself from. There have been people even stating to me that I'm not as funny as I used to be in older content, and this I think is true, and is because, as I've said before, I've made a conscious effort of late to move away from the old pattern that I began in, of frequent jokes and mockery with occasional data, to frequent or entirely data with the occasional joke or mock. Something that, while not as entertaining, I think, actually helps to combat at least the surface problem.
Yeah, okay, Tilde, that's fine. You're a brilliant researcher. And although your snark is also excellent, the research is more important, I have to admit. So if that's the creative direction you want to take your channel in, I'm probably not going to leave. However, dictating to other people this is what they should do as well, probably not the best idea. Or treating your decision as objectively good for everyone. It's not. Because in some cases you are going to be depriving the world of an excellent comedian and giving them a terrible researcher. Not everyone also has the time to do the research, but they might just have a genuine knack for being fucking hilarious. And they have jobs and lives and shit. I understand why you want to go this way, but it's not going to be the best idea for everyone.
Which is why I couldn't help but notice any supposed rebuttal to me is always aimed at really old content from back in the days when I was but a humble road sign.
Shit.
I see no inherent problem, as I've said, with the simple entertainment of the punchy, snarky, witty, humorous response. Entertainment is important, and serves as an entrance point for people into the more rational, empirical, data-driven side of this cultural clash we've seen growing in recent years. It's a humour-laden reminder to people, not directly involved, but who are just beginning to see the effects of social justice, feminism, and cultural Marxism in their lives, that they are not alone in thinking this is strange, weird, or outright crazy. However, I think there's a growing disparity between the numbers of people doing the humour entertainment side, the easy attention-grabbing part that, as we've seen from the explosion of channels doing it, that can lead to some pretty easy e-fame, and the number of people willing to dig deeper and do the legwork to interpret and understand data and its underlying causes.
Again, not every YouTuber who's doing this is necessarily capable of that. You might be fucking hilarious, but terrible at research.
So what are these underlying causes I've mentioned throughout this video? These, I think, are still the most contentious points within the camps of the manosphere, and things that I've addressed to varying degrees on this channel over the years. Things that go beyond the social and the political, and things that even within this same circle people still seem to have a deep knee-jerk aversion to even considering. Topics which are often met with the phobic cries of, "You're just as bad as the feminists!" The topics of gynocentrism and hypergamy.
If I didn't know any better, then I would say that whole little rant was poisoning the well. That everything up until now was an attempt at setting up a strawman, a caricature of an anti-feminist YouTuber, an immature, intellectually dishonest, shallow comedian who doesn't know much about feminist theory any more than lol look at the stupid feminists, and has no intention of looking into the hard data on the issue, let alone going further to understand the cultural, historical and biological explanations as to why feminism as a movement has been so successful, because they have some kind of aversion to evolutionary psychology. And this would be in opposition to the data-driven, honest, intellectual MGTOW truth-seekers, who are just being unjustly criticised for their totally 100% factual claims about gender relations. But I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. These two unrelated topics, biological determinism and unnecessary comedy, only made it into the same rant video by accident, even if that hypothesis would quite nicely explain why you refuse to pin those criticisms of the community onto a specific individual.
Things which have overwhelming data to demonstrate the effects and existence of in various fields, and yet still remain the hardest pills to swallow, and I think this stems from people's absolute lack of will to accept that biology can be a part of certain facets of behaviour.
Or maybe it's just how they're being told it.
Tell someone that their brain is wired to prefer sugar, fats and salts, high-caloric foods, a behaviour that is irrational in itself, these things being nothing more than carbon, hydrogen and oxygen mashed together in various forms, and yet they trigger in the brain a massive chemical response, endorphins, dopamine, etc. Tell people this and demonstrate it.
How would you demonstrate it, Tilde? If you were given the option, would you demonstrate it by showing scientific studies on the effects of sugar on the brain, or would you show them surveys of sweet shops?
And they have no trouble accepting that things such as the obesity epidemic, owing to overabundance of fatty, sugary foods in the rich Western nations, is simply a misappropriation and maladaptation of a behaviour bred into humans over a series of tens of thousands of years, dating back to before humans were even human, where individuals with a propensity for eating these things gained more calories, grew larger, stronger, more intelligent, whatever, and thus reproduced more, or had offspring better suited to their environment, and thus the feedback loop of biology and environment continued ever onwards in this direction, with individuals who had more of these receptors in their brain to feel this food rush, breeding more than those who had fewer, until it became the majority trend of the species in whatever geographical area that adaptation was best suited.
Most of that would mean jack shit if there weren't brain scans to back it up.
This is not contentious. We are told this every day in the media. It's accepted by all but the most staunch social constructionists, often within the fat acceptance movement. Tell certain people within the so-called manosphere that men's and women's aggregate differences in behavior in society come about as a result of basic socio-biological differences, that men's higher rates of testosterone lead to an increased likelihood of risk-taking behavior.
And again, this stuff would be demonstrated scientifically in controlled settings.
Something necessary to succeed in business, thus explaining why there are more male CEOs, but also more male homeless. After all, big risks either pay off big or fail big.
There's a bunch of different reasons why there's more male homeless and more male CEOs. Stop being a reductionist, Teal dear.
And again, only the most staunch social constructionists will find this objectionable. The blank slate theorists. Although given the overwhelming data against blank slate theory, I'm still surprised that there are any of them left. Tell this to them and then fill in the gaps about how the feedback loop of division of labour and sexual dimorphism necessitated certain social layouts, that is, hypergamous gynocentrism. Men being the on average more physically competent sex, on average greater muscle mass, higher aerobic capacity, with bodies that adapt to these things quicker and at higher thresholds, and women's need for a period of gestation for their babies and an extended nursing time led to societal arrangements that were made to benefit and protect women and encourage men to be of utility in this, is suddenly the line that gets crossed, and for whatever reason, this cannot happen.
Citation needed.
As soon as we hit that crucial line of daring to suggest that this arrangement led women to prefer men who protect them, prefer men who are the fittest and actively seek them out, and that it would lead men who fulfill the role of carer and provider to be more likely to reproduce.
I don't know the positions of the people that you're arguing with here, but here's my issue. That's not the problem. This is the problem. Hypergamy.
In very plain terms, hypergamy is the sexual reproductive strategy for women. It is the core instinct that drives them to get aroused and nest with a man, depending on that woman's current relationship state and the social dynamics at play in her life. You see, hypergamy, even if you do a very quick Google search, will be defined as the action of marrying a person of a superior caste or class. This is an aspect that can be crudely defined as the woman being naturally a gold digger.
If we consider that hypergamy, specifically the provision of resources, is probably the driving factor behind female reproductive choices, and I'm talking serious long-term relationship investment here, not a drunken hookup with some chiseled guy at the club.
Hypergamy. The idea that most of women's attraction to an individual man will be based upon how much shit he could buy her and how much social status she'll gain by fucking him. Or in other words, women are biologically programmed to be gold diggers. I'm sure there's just as much evidence for this as the rush you get when you eat sugar.
Hold up. Absolutely not. There is no biological basis for attraction or society at all.
Normally when you criticise an idea, Tildeer, you'll find an example of someone espousing that idea and then do a debunking style video about it. But here, what you've done is not actually show any examples of this position being espoused, but argue with the fucking air. Why is that? Are you intentionally strawmanning the people you're arguing with, specifically because you don't know their actual positions?
For some people, at least. Even though this is the exact same process that leads to the human universal of preferring sugars and fats, thus perpetuating a feedback loop of behaviour to the environment. Those who preferred the beneficial behaviour owing to minute brain differences that enabled fractionally different behavioural output were fitter in reproduction for such a long time frame that it became the norm. Phrase this in simple things like behaviour around eating, no problem. Frame it as a statement for preference in mating partners that then informs societal structure as a result of the basic process of survival of the fittest, absolutely not. Why? Why, as soon as this exact same process is used to identify the reason why women have, on aggregate, not all, but a majority, preference in always marrying up, to use the phrase loosely, this becomes a problem, even though it is easily observable and quantifiable.
We don't assume a behaviour is biologically programmed purely because it's just so common. That's not how we do science, Tildeer, and you know it. Stop being a fucking idiot about this.
If a woman could reproduce on her own, no need for external input, and all the necessary care was provided for her child, how many women would seek a stable partner? The answer is very few. Why commit to someone when you can get everything that person would provide, but without any of the downsides of having to deal with a person?
Did you hear it? I'll play it again.
Everything that person would provide.
Yes, apparently people don't get into relationships because they enjoy each other's company. They get into relationships for economic reasons.
Why self-impose any limitation when you could have total freedom?
Men are a burden, and the only thing they can give you is money. I wonder where they're getting this idea.
This is hypergamy left unchecked.
Or it's too many people who are boiling down relationships to nothing more than money and sex.
And actually forms the basis of pretty much all feminism's demands. We want women in XYZ fields. Men must do this for us. Why? Because if you don't, you hate women and won't ever get laid. We want the state to force companies to provide childcare. Men have to do this for us, men being the majority tax provider. Why? Because if you don't, it's because you hate women and won't ever get laid. Rinse and repeat ad nauseum for every issue feminism has ever talked about. Why is it the anti-feminist, anti-social justice warrior crowd is suddenly so anti-science when it comes to this point?
For someone who was complaining about this earlier,
but in reality is little more than calling the feminist in question a fucking moron and saying, you're wrong because you're stupid.
I'm sorry, but
You're wrong because you're anti-science.
that's not really much of a step up.
The people who will quite happily take the side of science when it suits to explain certain social patterns and social layouts suddenly spurn this very same science when it perfectly explains why the introduction of a welfare state and female birth control leads to the total disenfranchisement of men and basically the removal of any value they would have in society, leading us to the so-called man drought, with highly educated, high-earning women suddenly demanding that men must do better because they refuse to do what men have been more than willing to do throughout history and date and marry down.
I'll brush over your insinuation that men's only worth to women is material wealth and get into the actual science of the issue. The science of the issue. And you haven't produced any of your own standalone content on this, so I'm going to have to do the next best thing, which is the standalone content you uploaded on this, produced by another YouTuber, the aforementioned Sane. Let's do it your way! TL Dear, Sane doesn't understand relationships or attraction.
This is the OkCupid research blog post that often gets cited. Quote, "Our chart shows how men have rated women on a scale from 0 to 5. The curve is symmetric and surprisingly charitable. A woman is as likely to be considered extremely ugly as extremely beautiful, and the majority of women have been rated about medium. The chart looks normalized even though it is just the unfiltered opinion of our male users." End quote. Quote, "As you can see from the grey line, women rate an incredible 80% of guys as worse looking than medium. Very harsh." End quote. Now, this data from OkCupid is corroborated by other sources. Tinder, for example, also shows a very clear gender differential, with women swiping right only 15% of the time versus men swiping right 47% of the time. I actually find this fact particularly interesting, that on a platform like Tinder, which rates and judges individuals purely on the basis of looks.
And this is also very important. So was the data from OkCupid.
We see such a wide gender disparity in male versus female appraisal of attractiveness.
So what can we get from this? Women are more picky when it comes to appearance than men? At least on OkCupid and Tinder? Okay. Could we go further? Men have a harder time finding success on these sites because the likelihood of initiating interactions being so heavily based on appearance, meaning men have an automatic handicap or women have a head start, depending on how you look at it. Sure, there's a case to be made there. Could you even go so far as to say that this is anything to do with the current culture applauding women for having extremely unrealistic standards for their partners, while shaming men for having any standards at all, skewing the data? I'd say that's almost definitely a factor. But the data here isn't necessarily representative of the entire population. One's a dating site and one's a hookup website, meaning selection bias is gonna play a part. And since neither of these have shown real attempts to control for variables, meaning they're not exactly scientific studies, the amount you can extrapolate from this into the real world is not much.
Well, what we end up with is essentially a transfer function, or S-curve. These are very important in machine learning systems for determining the likelihood that a specific piece of input data has crossed a certain learned threshold.
It almost sounds like he knows what he's doing.
In this case, the input data is the man's relative population ranking, and the output is the likelihood that women will find him attractive. So, assuming that Mark is in the 90th percentile, women would find him very attractive. But as he approaches and crosses that attraction threshold into undesirability, his perceived sexual and social market value starts to plummet in the eyes of women. You see, the same transfer function applies to women too. The attraction threshold for women is much more reasonable. When we draw the transfer function for women on the same graph, with their attraction threshold being at about 50%, a massive 30 percentiles lower than men.
Now, I could beat you again over the head with the applying to the entire population, but I won't. Let's go into what he means by attractiveness.
If we consider that hypergamy, specifically the provision of resources, is probably the driving factor behind female reproductive choices, and I'm talking serious long-term relationship investment here, not a drunken hookup with some chiseled guy at the club.
You see what he did there? He's taken the original attractiveness variable, which was measured by some ratings of photos on a survey in swipes right, and applied them to a graph that actually measures the success of long-term relationships based upon a man's material wealth. Two very, very different things. And I guess a woman's... Actually, I don't know. Maybe physical appearance? He doesn't actually say, so it's up to you, really. But he managed to hide this by using the same term for both, sneakily changing the definition without you noticing, otherwise known as equivocation. Which is why, if you go and watch the video, there's a bunch of fluff in between. It's designed to allow him to it gives him enough time to repeat the word and permutations of the word attractive enough times so that it makes you think that what was originally measured by the surveys was some kind of abstract attractiveness that can be applied to long-term relationships rather than pure physical appearance. I.e., ratings of photos on fucking OkCupid and swipes right on fucking Tinder. But... Carl Sane, if you do end up watching this, well done. Well played, my good sir. You didn't just manage to fool at least 2,000 people and upwards of maybe 10,000. You managed to pull one over on Teal Deer. That's fucking impressive. So, all I can say is bravo.
The problem that should be immediately clear is that there is going to be an extremely large difference of perceived social value in all of these relationships. You see, even though two people may exist in the exact same percentile on this population graph ranking relative attractiveness, in her mind she sees herself as an 8 dating a 3. To her, it's a bad reproductive investment, but due to market pressures, i.e., she doesn't want to be lonely or she wants to start a family, these are the only men available in her relative population percentile, so she goes ahead and makes the relationship investment anyway. Over time, this perception that she's invested in worthless relationship stock, somebody who's fundamentally not good enough for her, will only lead to discontent and eventual divorce.
So, you use data that's unrepresentative, applied the measure of attractiveness to something entirely different to the original data, and then I'm supposed to believe that this ever-changing variable of attractiveness is the defining factor in relationship success. That people of comparable attractiveness fare better together than incomparable, because the partner will assume themselves superior to the other partner based upon nothing more than this nebula factor that they're somehow magically aware of, and divorce over it. And this explains the divorce rate. I'm sorry. This is not only pathetic pseudoscience, it's also insanely reductionistic. It just doesn't in any way take into account the nuances of human interaction. It doesn't talk about how different personality traits just interact with each other on the base level, and how these different concentrations of said traits in men and women may have an effect on gender dynamics. It doesn't say anything about how plenty of relationships are failing over purely logistical reasons that cause stress. The death of a relative or a loss of a job can just make life more stressful for that couple, and then because it's more stressful they have more arguments, and then they end up hating each other, not because of some kind of hypergamous instinct that women have, but just because they're humans and they have emotional reactions to bad things happening, and bad things happen to people all the fucking time. I'm sorry, this isn't science. This is propaganda dressed up as science.
And I know what the reaction to this will be, even from those who, as I've said, will happily use this same science when it suits them. They will turn on this explanation and call it pseudoscience, call it biological determinism, call it anything that they can to attempt to discredit the very same process that they happily defend and exploit in their own argumentation when it suits them.
Who is they?
There is no judgment in this explanation, no good or bad, right or wrong, in pointing out that this process happens, that owing to evolutionary pressure and the rise of certain reproductive strategies as a result of that pressure, that this strategy should then become a maladaptation because technology moves so much faster than biology.
There is a difference between it's unfeasible and it's unfounded. You're strawmanning your fucking strawman.
There is no judgment here. This is not a call for people to stop sleeping with whoever they want, not a call for men at large to man up and do what women want them to do, as they have always done for millennia, the very core of gynocentrism, nor is it a call for women to abandon all standards and desires and get back to being baby-making kitchen utensils. No, this is merely an observation of what is happening as a result of what has happened in the past.
That observation still needs to be held up to scrutiny, you fucking demagogue.
And God help you should you dare mention anything surrounding intelligence and genetic populations, because that clearly means you're just a racist promoting pseudoscience because evolution stops at the neck.
No, it's just that studies like that are based upon IQ, and IQ is a terrible measure of intelligence.
So let's wrap this up, shall we? Anti-feminism as it stands seems to be rapidly moving towards being nothing more than a science-denying entertainment industry, with commentators rising left, right and centre looking for a quick grab of e-fame and to cash in by preaching to the ever-hungry choir, eager to reconfirm their already held position.
This is nothing more than a character assassination. He refuses to even name a single individual who fits this mould, because if he did, then he would actually have to stick by these fucking assertions.
And these are the people who, without one hint of irony or self-awareness, say it's communities like the MGTOW community who are just as bad as the feminists. The community that has been speaking about the necessity of understanding the biological factors, the relation of society to biology via the study of sociobiology, and the importance of evolutionary psychology for at least half a decade now. They might not get everything right first time, but at least that community is willing to explore the ideas and tread outside the safe space of exclusively blaming culture and politics for everything.
Still gonna keep saying this.
Citation needed.
Something that is the very core of feminist critical theory. It's funny how even with the ever-burgeoning ranks of anti-feminist entertainers, that there has been no change societally, no change in policy, no change in the court system's favouring of women, no change in the legal stances around genital mutilation.
We are fighting a juggernaut. One that has billions in terms of international funding, a stranglehold over the mainstream and alternative media, most of the government and the education system. It influences people from the fucking cradle, and you're indoctrinated into it before you even leave school. My brother's school has a gender studies class. He's 15, and his description of it is pure hardline feminist ideology. They are teaching this to kids younger than ever now. And on top of all of that, this shit plays into people's inherent biases. And you're surprised that all the opposition to it amounts to is a couple 100,000 people online, most of them anonymous because it would destroy their lives to speak out against it, and a handful of people in real life. And you wonder why this group of people has yet to actually get any genuine political change done. Have you actually even been to a mandate meeting where all the top MRAs in the UK go to discuss real future activism? It's a room full of 20 guys, mostly tired veterans, and a couple of teenagers whose best qualification to being an activist is talking about this shit online. I was one of those people. Yeah. The MRM is undermanned, underfunded, scattered, disorganised, and politically unpopular. It's not going to get shit done yet because it's a movement in its infancy, so get off your high horse. The MRM has yet to hit the required critical mass for actual political change to occur. But don't you dare complain at MRAs for that, and then go and champion the very people who say men's rights activism is futile and tell people not to fucking bother. That's not really why you're saying this shit. If I were to speculate, it's because you're too contrarian now. It's not good enough to accept
that Anita Sarkeesian doesn't understand video games, Lacey Green is stupid, MTV is a centre of race-baiting propaganda, and BuzzFeed is the internet equivalent of getting arse cancer in your brain.
And just not be in the way of egalitarian human rights advocacy. You also have to become an acolyte of Stardust, Coltane, CS MGTOW and Barbarossa, and whatever other pseudo-intellectual demagogues TLD demands you support, and suck them off after every bullshit piece of hack philosophy and amateur research they pull out of their asses. Or otherwise, you're a fucking science-denying social constructionist who harms the fight against feminism, just because you show some level of mild skepticism towards their pseudo-intellectual bastardization of evolutionary psychology. This was not an honest video. This was not some kind of, brain dump critique. No, this was a condescending lecture from someone who's let their e-fame get to their head and wants to scream, my content is objectively better than yours, and I'm so much smarter and more intellectual and more truth seeker than you. This is someone who's becoming an ideologue. Teal dear, this is a warning. Snap out of it. You are smarter than this. You are better than this. Please.